8 Golden Age stars were destroyed by drugs. She died on the floor of a squalid apartment. Her body found only after her dog began eating her remains. He was discovered in an abandoned building, buried as a John Doe for over a year. She never made it past 40. He died looking 20 years older than his actual age. This isn't one tragedy. This is the system working exactly as designed. Behind the dazzling Maras of Hollywood's golden age lurked a machine that didn't just discover stars. It manufactured, exploited, and ultimately destroyed them. The drugs that fueled this machine weren't accidental. They were deliberate tools of control. The pills weren't recreation. They were professional requirements, revealed a former studio doctor who worked through the 1950s. Amphetamines to keep them shooting 18-hour days, barbiturates to knock them out between calls. When they inevitably became addicted, the studios acted shocked, as if they hadn't created these dependencies themselves. The pattern was brutally efficient. Build stars up, drug them to maintain impossible schedules, discard them when the addiction made them unreliable, then pretend it was all their personal failing. What makes these stories truly sickening isn't just the wasted lives. It's how the same industry that handed a 13-year-old girl her first amphetamines would later blacklist her for the addiction they created. How the same executives who kept doctors on payroll to dispense pills would express public disappointment when their stars lost control. Hollywood gave them the pills, then blamed them when they worked. Today, we're exposing the 10 most devastating drug tragedies from Hollywood's so-called golden age. The studio created addictions, the careers incinerated, the bodies discovered too late. This isn't just celebrity gossip. It's evidence of an industry built on systematic destruction of the very people who made it wealthy. But first, let's start with the most heartbreaking case of all. The child star who went from Disney's golden boy to dying alone on a filthy mattress. His body unclaimed, his identity forgotten by the very industry that had once celebrated him. But he's mine. Jenny gave him to me. What your mom going to say when you come home with that dog? She ain't going to allow you to have no meaning. Bobby Driscoll, Disney's throwaway child. When Walt Disney needed the perfect all-American boy to build his early live-action empire around, he chose Bobby Driscoll. With his expressive eyes and natural talent, Driscoll became Disney's first contract child actor, the face of wholesome family entertainment and the voice of Peter Pan. Then he grew up, and Disney threw him away like garbage. They didn't just fire him when he hit puberty and his face changed, explained a Disney historian who requested anonymity. They blacklisted him, told other studios he was difficult. The same company that had worked him 60-hour weeks as a child made sure he couldn't get work anywhere else. The psychological devastation was immediate. Imagine being the most special child in America one day, then worthless the next. Driscoll, unprepared for this whiplash rejection, found himself bullied in regular school by classmates jealous of his former fame. His once adorable face was changing, his confidence shattered. By 17, he was self-medicating with whatever he could find. Alcohol at first, then heroin. Disney taught me to use drugs. He confided to a friend before his death. The studio gave me pills to stay awake, pills to sleep I was using before I even knew what addiction was. Let that sink in. The company synonymous with childhood innocence introduced Driscoll to pharmaceuticals as a professional tool when he was still losing baby teeth. By his early 20s, Driscoll's descent was in freefall. Arrests for drug possession, jagged attempts at comeback roles, increasingly desperate efforts to escape the identity of the child star no one wanted anymore. In 1968, children playing in an abandoned tenement building in New York's East Village made a gruesome discovery: a body on a cot, surrounded by religious pamphlets and empty beer bottles. With no identification and a face unrecognizable from his famous childhood, the man was buried as a John Doe in a pauper's grave on Hart Island. It would be nearly a year before fingerprint records identified Hollywood's former golden boy. He was Disney's golden boy. Then he died alone, broke, and forgotten, summarized a biographer. The most haunting part is that the boy who played Peter Pan, who would never grow up on screen, died so young yet aged beyond recognition by hard living. Driscoll was just 31 years old. The company that had once put his face on lunchboxes and comic books never acknowledged his death. And my eyesight is so bad it's getting difficult to read eyes of the CUC. Judy Garland, MGM's chemical casualty. The most sickening part of Judy Garland's story isn't that she died of a barbiturate overdose. It's that her first pills were forced on her by studio executives when she was just 13 years old. MGM didn't just suggest she take amphetamines. They had studio doctors administer them while her mother watched, revealed a former MGM employee who witnessed the system firsthand. They called them pep pills and told this child they were vitamins. When she got hungry, they gave her appetite suppressants. When she couldn't sleep from all the uppers in her system, they gave her barbiturates. This wasn't occasional medicating. This was systematic chemical management of a child's body to maintain the shooting schedule for The Wizard of Oz and subsequent films. By 16, Garland was fully dependent on the up or downer cycle, a dependency she didn't choose and didn't initially understand. Studio head Louis B., Mayer and his fixers managed her doses, monitored her weight, and controlled every aspect of her developing body through pharmaceuticals. They gave her pills to wake up, pills to sleep, pills to eat, pills to not eat, explained her biographer. Then they had the audacity to lecture her about self-control when she couldn't function without the very chemicals they had made her dependent on. The most heartbreaking detail, Garland's death certificate. Under occupation, it reads singer and actress as if her true profession hadn't been victim of studio chemical management. When MGM finally fired her in 1950 after 15 years of chemical manipulation, they didn't offer rehab. They didn't acknowledge their role in creating her addiction. They labeled her difficult and unreliable industry code words for an addict they created but no longer wanted to manage. Hollywood gave her the pills, then blamed her when they worked exactly as designed, noted an addiction specialist who has studied Garland's case. She wasn't a cautionary tale of celebrity excess. She was a deliberately manufactured addict who never consented to the dependency that eventually killed her. She died alone in a rented London bathroom, her body discovered by her fifth husband. She was 47 but looked 67. Her body aged decades beyond its years by the chemical assault that began when she was still playing with dolls. The studio executives who first put pills in her teenage hands all outlived her. "Where are you going?" "I'm going to drop you off at your house." "Where are you going?" "I'm going with you." Gail Russell, Paramount's terrified beauty. Some stars turn to drugs for recreation. Gail Russell turned to alcohol for survival because it was the only way she could face the camera that terrified her. Paramount saw a beautiful face and threw her in front of cameras without a minute of acting training, explained a film historian specializing in Golden Age actresses. She was pathologically shy, trembling with stage fright, so severe she would vomit before scenes. Instead of training her gradually, they told her to drink. This wasn't subtle encouragement. Russell's paralyzing camera anxiety was so obvious that directors and crew members would literally hand her drinks before difficult scenes. The studio system had no patience for psychological support. Alcohol was faster, cheaper, and immediately effective at getting the day's shooting completed. "Take the edge off," they told the terrified young woman. "Just a few drinks to calm your nerves." Those few drinks became a dependency, so severe it transformed her from one of Hollywood's most ethereal beauties to a bloated, trembling wreck within just a few years. The drinking that began as studio-sanctioned self-medication evolved into full-blown alcoholism that made her increasingly unemployable. The most gut-wrenching part, Russell wasn't even interested in being an actress. Paramount talent scouts discovered her while she was attending art school, pursuing her actual passion. The studio system seized on her extraordinary face, forced her into a profession that triggered her deepest anxieties, then chemically managed those anxieties with a substance that would ultimately destroy her. She drank to survive, and it killed her faster than fame did. Observed a director who worked with Russell in her better years. The studio gave an untrained, pathologically shy girl the impossible choice of either drinking or failing. When the drinking eventually made her unemployable, they discarded her without a second thought. Russell died alone in her apartment in 1961, surrounded by empty bottles. She was 36, but looked decades older, her legendary beauty ravaged by the very substance she'd been encouraged to use to make that beauty marketable. Her body wasn't discovered for days. The cruelest irony, Her death certificate listed effect of alcohol as the cause with no mention of the industry that first put the bottle in her hand. I must say, it's a pleasure to be here. And Montgomery Cliff, beauty shattered, pain unleashed. The car wrapped around the telephone pole on a winding California road in 1956. Inside was Montgomery Cliff, the actor many consider Marlon Brando's only true rival, the sensitive leading man whose emotional range and striking good looks had redefined American masculinity on screen. He survived the crash, but the Montgomery Cliff who emerged from reconstructive surgery was effectively a different person. His face permanently altered, his spirit broken, and his relationship with pain management about to destroy everything he'd built. After the accident, he wasn't just in physical pain, explained a close friend who witnessed Cliff's decline. He was in existential crisis. Half his identity had been tied to being the most beautiful man in movies. The mirror now showed a different person, and the pain never stopped. What followed was a pharmaceutical nightmare that would now be recognized as iatrogenic addiction. Doctor-created dependency through overprescription. Different physicians prescribed overlapping painkillers. No one monitored the dangerous combinations or escalating dosages. Cliff, desperate for relief from both physical and psychological agony, followed doctors' orders while adding alcohol to the deadly cocktail. He took what they gave him, then more when that stopped working, said his biographer. The medicine cabinets in his home looked like pharmacy shelves, bottles everywhere, many from different doctors who never consulted each other. The transformation was shockingly fast. Within 3 years of the accident, the actor, once considered among Hollywood's most reliable and prepared performers, was now struggling to remember lines. His hands shook, his speech sometimes slurred. Insurance companies began requiring special bonds for productions featuring him, an additional cost that made studios hesitant to cast him despite his extraordinary talent. Friends watched in horror as the brilliant actor disappeared into a fog of pharmaceuticals and alcohol. Directors who recognized his genius developed elaborate systems to work around his increasingly unreliable condition, shooting his scenes early in the day, using body doubles for distance shots, editing around his worst moments. He was brilliant, but pain and pills eclipsed everything. Observe a director who worked with Cliff in his final years. The tragedy wasn't just that the accident changed his face. It's that the medical system's response to that accident destroyed his mind. On July 23, 1966, Cliff's private nurse found him dead in his New York bedroom. The official cause was a heart attack, but the real killer was a decadal-long pharmaceutical assault on his system. A lethal combination of alcohol and prescription medications that had gradually damaged his heart beyond repair. He was 45 years old. The medicine bottles found in his home, all legally prescribed, numbered over 30. Bologna and how? God, that's enough. Bela Lugosi, Dracula's real-life nightmare. The cruel irony of Bela Lugosi's life is that the man who portrayed immortality on screen will be destroyed by his attempts to manage very mortal pain. Everyone remembers him as Dracula, but no one talks about why he became addicted to morphine, explained a film historian specializing in horror cinema. It wasn't recreational. Lugosi had severe chronic sciatic pain from years of physical performances. In the 1930s, opiates were the only effective treatment available. What began as legitimate pain management evolved into dependency as tolerance developed. Lugosi's increasing need for pain relief coincided with career decline. His Hungarian accent and TYP casting as Dracula, limiting his roles as a horror genre evolved beyond the Gothic traditions he embodied. This professional frustration created psychological strain that intensified his reliance on medication. The less he worked, the more he focused on his physical discomfort. The more medication he took, the less employable he became. It was a downward spiral with pharmacological rocket fuel. By the late 1940s, Lugosi's opiate addiction was significantly impacting his appearance and reliability. The commanding physical presence that had defined his earlier performances gave way to a gaunt, sometimes disoriented demeanor. Major studios stopped calling entirely. The desperate final act of his career, appearing in infamously bad Ed Wood films for just a few hundred, wasn't the choice of a man with options. It was a last resort of an addict taking any work that might pay for his next prescription. He played the undead and lived like one in the end, observed a substance abuse counselor who has studied celebrity addiction patterns. Lugosi's case demonstrates how quickly legitimate medical use can transform into life, destroying dependency when pain, career decline, and increasing tolerance intersect. In 1955, Lugosi took the then unprecedented step of publicly acknowledging his addiction and seeking treatment, a decision requiring considerable courage in an era when substance dependency carried significant stigma. He checked into a rehabilitation facility and spoke openly about his struggles, hoping to both recover personally and destigmatize addiction treatment for others. The rehabilitation methods of the time were primitive by modern standards. While Lugosi achieved periods of sobriety, the underlying chronic pain remained unresolved. Without effective alternate pain management strategies, relapse became almost inevitable. He died in 1956 at age 73, financially ruined despite having created one of cinema's most iconic characters. The gap between his cultural significance and personal circumstances could hardly have been wider. In a final indignity that perfectly captured his career trajectory, Lugosi was buried wearing one of the Dracula capes from his performing days, permanently linking him with the character that had made him famous, while contributing to the typecasting that limited his options as his pain and addiction worsened. The doctors who had prescribed his medications for decades without adequate monitoring or alternative treatments attended neither his funeral nor the addiction treatment programs that might have helped him avoid creating similar dependencies in other patients. I haven't had a chance for quite a while to get that close to his heart. Dina, Barbara Payton Hollywood's fastest fall. No Hollywood descent matches Barbara Payton's for sheer velocity. In 5 years, she went from Warner Brothers contract star to street prostitute, a transformation so rapid and complete it defies comprehension. One of Hollywood's fastest and most brutal falls, noted her biographer, John O'Dowd. Drugs and alcohol didn't just end her career. They erased her entire identity. Payton's initial break came in the 1950s Kiss Tomorrow, Goodbye opposite James Cagney, a role that suggested significant potential. With her platinum blonde hair and voluptuous figure, she embodied the exact quality studios were marketing in the early 1950s. Her professional destruction began with a love triangle involving actors Franchot Tone and Tom Neal that erupted into tabloid headlines when Neal beat Tone so severely he required hospitalization. While this scandal damaged both men's careers, it effectively ended Payton's, reflecting the double standard applied to women in Hollywood. A female star associated with violence, even as its indirect cause, became unmarketable. This professional rejection accelerated Payton's already established tendencies towards substance abuse. As legitimate acting offers disappeared, she began using alcohol, barbiturates, and eventually heroin, not just for recreation, but as chemical management of depression and anxiety about her collapsing career. She used everything: pills, booze, eventually heroin, explained a friend who knew her during this decline. She wasn't just partying. She was medicating crushing despair with whatever she could find. The physical transformation was shockingly swift. Photos from 1951 show a stunning blonde starlet. By 1956, she appeared 2 decades older, bloated, disheveled, her once perfect features distorted by substance abuse and hardship. As her addiction intensified, her financial resources evaporated. With no support system and an industry that had completely abandoned her, Payton made an unthinkable transition. From Warner Brothers contract player to Sunset Boulevard prostitute in less than a decade. She was turning tricks on the same streets where theaters had shown her movies just a few years earlier, said her biographer. Sometimes Johns would recognize her from films, creating surreal interactions that drove her further into substance abuse to numb the humiliation. The cruel geometry of her destruction was perfect. Drugs and alcohol made her unemployable. Unemployment created financial desperation. Desperation led to prostitution. The psychological trauma of prostitution intensified her substance dependency. Each element amplified the others in a self-reinforcing cycle of annihilation. Payton died in 1967 at age 39. Her body destroyed by years of substance abuse, liver damage, heart problems, and malnutrition. The autopsy revealed a system so compromised it resembled that of someone decades older. Her New York Times obituary was 2 sentences long. I would not have taken Errol Flynn, the swashbuckler who poisoned himself. Errol Flynn didn't just play danger on screen. He mainlined it directly into his veins. Alcohol, opiates, cocaine, and barbiturates, listed a film historian who documented Flynn's substances of choice, often all in the same day, sometimes in the same drink. His body was a pharmaceutical battlefield where different drugs fought for dominance while his organs suffered collateral damage. What made Flynn's case distinctive wasn't just a variety of his consumption, but how directly it contrasted with his on-screen persona. As Robin Hood in Captain Blood, he embodied physical vitality and athletic prowess. Off-screen, he was systematically destroying the very body that had made him famous. He didn't discriminate between substances, explained his biographer. Uppers in the morning to get moving, alcohol throughout the day, cocaine for energy, heroin, or barbiturates to come down. His daily intake would have killed most people, but his tolerance was legendary until it wasn't. The transformation of Flynn's appearance tracked the progression of his addictions. The dashing swashbuckler of the 1930s evolved into the puffy, trembling figure of the 1950s. His once trim physique softened, his famously handsome face became bloated, and his legendary stamina diminished to the point where body doubles handled most physical actions in his later films. By his 40s, Flynn could barely climb a flight of stairs without becoming winded, noted a director who worked with him in his later years. His hands shook so badly that close-ups of him holding objects had to be filmed with another actor's hands. This was a man who had once performed his own stunts and sword fights. The professional consequences were predictable. Insurance companies began requiring special bonds for Flynn's films. Directors developed elaborate strategies to work around his condition, shooting his scenes early in the day before heavy drinking began, using doubles whenever possible, and structuring scenes so Flynn could remain seated or stationary. What's particularly tragic is that Flynn's substance use became part of his marketable image, the hard adventure star whose off-screen exploits matched his film persona. This public embrace of his legendary consumption created barriers to intervention. How could someone seek help for a drinking problem that had become central to their public brand? Flynn died in Vancouver in 1959, allegedly while trying to sell his yacht to cover mounting debts. The official cause was heart attack and circulatory failure, but the real killer was 2 decades of sustained chemical assault on his cardiovascular system. He was just 50 years old. The medical examiner famously reported that Flynn had the body of a 70-year-old man, every major organ showing damage consistent with decades of substance abuse. He lived fast and died long before his time, observed a biographer. The same substances that initially seemed to enhance his wild living image eventually erased that image completely, leaving behind a cautionary tale that Hollywood repeatedly fails to learn from. Flynn's self-destruction through substance abuse created a template that countless stars would follow in subsequent decades. The hard, celebrity whose pharmaceutical adventures initially generate fascinating publicity before inevitably destroying the very qualities that made them marketable. Found this in your husband's pocket. John Drew Barrymore, The Dynasty of Destruction. The most haunting aspect of John Drew Barrymore's addiction isn't that it destroyed his own promising career. It's that it represented the middle chapter in a 3-generation saga of talent and self-destruction that would eventually reach his daughter Drew. The Barrymore name didn't save him. It crushed him, observed a historian specializing in Hollywood dynasties. John Drew inherited not just his father's extraordinary talent, but also his predisposition to addiction, genetic vulnerability, combined with the psychological burden of living in the shadow of both greatness and notorious self-destruction. His father, the legendary John Barrymore, had been one of America's greatest actors before alcohol destroyed his career and ultimately killed him. John Drew showed genuine promise in his early roles, suggesting he might successfully carry forward the family's artistic tradition while avoiding its self-destructive patterns. This potential remained unrealized as substance issues gradually overtook his professional reliability. What began with alcohol, perhaps reflecting both genetic vulnerability and learned coping mechanisms from observing his father's generation, expanded to include LSD, amphetamines, and whatever else became available in the 1960s Hollywood. Career derailed by LSD, amphetamine, and alcohol, explained a colleague who worked with him in the 1960s. John Drew wasn't just dabbling. He was consuming industrial quantities of whatever he could find. He'd disappear for days, then return with no memory of where he'd been or what he'd done. The professional consequences were predictable and devastating. Missed rehearsals, forgotten lines, and erratic behavior led to fewer legitimate offers. Major studios, initially interested in the Barrymore name, became unwilling to risk investment on an increasingly unreliable performer. Arrested, blacklisted, and eventually homeless, said his biographer. By the late 1960s, no reputable production would hire him. Regardless of his last name, his behavior had become so unpredictable that even longtime friends hesitated to help, knowing he might disappear with their money or possessions to fund his next binge. The final decades of John Drew's life were spent in increasing isolation and financial precarity. Though never completely homeless for extended periods, he experienced episodes of housing insecurity, sometimes staying with friends or in cheap motel while struggling with ongoing substance issues. Throughout this period, his relationship with his daughter, Drew Barrymore, was minimal and complicated. Born in 1975, she rarely saw her father during childhood and would eventually face her own well-documented substance struggles as a child actress, beginning drug use at age 9 and entering rehabilitation by 13. When I was born, my dad was already gone. Drew Barrymore later recalled, not just physically absent, chemically absent. The few times I saw him, he wasn't really there. He was whatever substance he was on at the moment. John Drew Barrymore died in 2004 at age 72. Long estranged from the entertainment industry that had once welcomed him as acting royalty, his death received limited media attention, a stark contrast to the front-page coverage that had greeted his father's passing decades earlier. His legacy exists primarily as the middle link in a chain of addiction that stretched from his father to his daughter, a genetic and environmental predisposition that nearly claimed a third-generation victim before Drew Barrymore managed to break the cycle that had destroyed her father and grandfather. 3 generations of Barrymores, 3 generations of addiction. Noted a substance abuse specialist familiar with the family history. It's as close as we get to seeing addiction's genetic component play out in public view, with each generation fighting the same biochemical vulnerabilities, usually without understanding the biological forces driving their behavior. The pill-pushing machine hasn't stopped. The stories of these destroyed stars, Judy Garland, Bobby Driscoll, Gail Russell, Montgomery Clift, Bela Lugosi, Barbara Payton, Errol Flynn, and John Drew Barrymore aren't just historical tragedies. They're evidence of a system that continues functioning today with only superficial changes to its fundamental mechanics. The substances have evolved, but the dynamics remain disturbingly similar. Observe an addiction specialist who has treated entertainment figures across multiple generations. Studios no longer directly distribute pills to performers, but the pressure to maintain impossible schedules and appearances still creates the conditions where dependency becomes almost inevitable. What connects these seemingly different cases are consistent patterns of exploitation that transform human vulnerability into profit until that vulnerability becomes unprofitable. Child stars like Garland and Driscoll were explicitly given stimulants and sedatives as professional tools, their developing brains permanently altered by studio-mandated chemical management. Adult performers like Russell and Cliff received substances as solutions to professional challenges like stage fright or injury recovery. They weren't destroyed by drugs, emphasized the entertainment industry historian. They were destroyed by a system that introduced them to drugs, normalized their use as professional necessities, then discarded them when inevitable dependencies became inconvenient. The particular cruelty of this system lies in how it presents addiction as personal moral failure rather than predictable outcome of institutional practices. Studios that once provided pep pills to child performers expressed shocked disappointment when those same performers couldn't function without stimulants as adults. Producers who encouraged actresses to take the edge, off with alcohol before difficult scenes later labeled them unreliable when drinking became habitual. Hollywood has always excelled at rewriting history, noted the historian. These weren't random tragedies or cautionary tales of excess. They were the system working exactly as designed. Extracting maximum value from talent. Using chemicals to extend that value beyond natural human limits, then discarding the damage results while accepting no responsibility for the destruction. What makes these historical cases particularly valuable is how they illuminate current practices. While studios no longer directly distribute pharmaceuticals, the pressure to use performance-enhancing substances remains implicit in impossible shooting schedules, physical appearance standards, and expectations of constant availability. From Judy Garland to Heath Ledger, the pattern repeats with devastating regularity, concluded the addiction specialist. The entertainment industry creates impossible demands, directly or indirectly encourages chemical solutions to meet those demands, then expresses shock and sadness when addiction inevitably results. Until the underlying conditions change, these stories will continue accumulating regardless of how many cautionary examples history provides. These Golden Age casualties weren't destroyed by drugs. They were destroyed by an industry that treated talent as disposable, health as irrelevant, and human beings as extractable resources to be discarded when their commercial value diminished. The pills weren't the disease. They were merely the symptoms of a system that continues destroying lives today. One prescription, one breakdown, one overdose at a time.